Computer. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Michael Alessandri. Dr. Alessandri holds a very special place in our hearts, not only for his remarkable contributions to the autism community, but also for the meaningful relationship that we share through our organization, Autism Connect of Trinidad and Tobago, and this new collaborative effort we have. Michael has been very supportive in advancing our efforts here locally, and we're deeply honored to have him join us today. Michael, go ahead, introduce yourself and your role you play at CARD, and let's dig a little deeper into parent advocacy.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. Of course, it's a pleasure to be with you, Donella. I've enjoyed getting to know you over the past few years, and I'm excited about the future collaborations that we're planning. So this is a great way to kick that off, I think. So yes, I am Dr. Michael Alessandri. I'm the executive director of a program here at the University of Miami called CARD. It stands for the Center for Autism and Related Disabilities. And we have been around since 1993. We're actually celebrating our 30th anniversary this year in 23-24. Which will culminate in a big event next Saturday, big fundraising gala here at the Intercontinental in Miami. So we're very excited about that. We have like 600 of our great friends and supporters coming out to just help keep the program alive. I think and I wear some other hats, so I'll just throw that out there too. So in addition to being the executive director of CARD, I'm also the assistant chairman of the Department of Psychology at the University of Miami. I am also the board chairperson for the L's for Autism Foundation, which is in Jupiter, Florida, and I'm on the board of another organization called Casa Familia, which is building affordable housing units for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities here in South Florida, and then a number of other organizations as well I'm on the board of. So I'm a little bit busy, but CARD is my heart and soul. And what I love about CARD is its mission. And the most important thing that people should know is CARD has been funded continuously by the state of Florida, at a relatively low rate, but at a rate that allows us to deliver, high quality services since 1993. And it's all because of parents, honestly. I mean, parents in the late 80s were concerned that there was not enough high quality evidence-based information on the ground in Florida in local communities. And so they banded together and started to go to Tallahassee, our capital, to advocate for more resources for people with autism. And that culminated because of those parental advocacy efforts. Obviously, there were some professionals involved as well, but really it was the parent voices and the parents making the strong case for government support to make sure that individuals with autism and their family members and their schools and the communities and doctors all had the best possible resources and information that they could have. And that culminated in a pilot project, which initially launched at the University of South Florida. And then once that was proven to be successful, it expanded to three other sites, including the University of Miami. But we're now at 7 sites, all university-based throughout the state of Florida. And any individual in Florida who has an autism diagnosis or a related disability can register for services with the CARD Center. And all of those services are provided at no cost to the families. So we now have, probably between 70 and 80,000 families registered at one of the CARD centers throughout the state of Florida, all receiving no cost support. So it's resources, referrals, we provide extensive training, we do school-based consultations, we do community outreach, public awareness, like what I'm doing with you today. This would be considered really public awareness, public education, with the goal of building capacity in the communities, expanding the knowledge and the skill levels of people in the community. We also have, in addition to all those technical pieces, we have something called the Autism Friendly Initiative, where we create partnerships with local businesses and local art centers and healthcare facilities and airports and you name it, in creating more autism friendly spaces and places for our family members so that everyone can be more successful in an inclusive, community-based experience. So we now have dozens and dozens of partners and programs throughout South Florida, and actually with all our partners across the state, throughout the state. So it's a monumental program. I mean, it's really massive in its scope, and very impactful, and a very good return on investment, because the actual cost to run the program relative to the impact is quite, quite affordable for the state of Florida. It's a very small, dollar amount in the state budget. So I think of a place like, Trinidad, and I think this could be a wonderful investment by the government to create something similar that would have a huge impact on families. So you and I have talked about that a lot in the past. And it's just, it's, again, it's parent advocacy. Parents really have to be the ones. When I go to Tallahassee, they're happy to see me, Dr. Alessandri, we love your work. We really appreciate what you're doing, but I really want to hear from the parents. I really want to hear from the people with autism. No one really wants to hear from the professionals. They respect us, but the message is much stronger, much more compelling when it comes from a family about what they actually need to make their life better.
Certainly, and it's their voices that really, and we aspire to only have that connection. And I think that's what Autism Connect really is reaching out, and that's the work that we are really putting forth, and hoping that you can continue to guide us with that. And because of your success, that's why we even asked you here today, Michael, and trying to guide those parent voices. So yes, we want them to speak up and have a voice and to be heard for what they want and what they need. But I feel like our parents, and this is based on my personal experience with interacting with my parent community, I feel like the parents almost need some kind of guide to just help them navigate through that process. And can you share some examples of how they can be a stronger voice, and how they can, where can they start?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, there are many different ways. I think telling their stories, like really thinking about how they want to share their story. First of all, starting with thinking through if they want to share their story. A lot of people are very private. A lot of people are not as comfortable disclosing that they're dealing with a developmental disability, either in themselves or in a loved one. And so I think the first step is, finding a community of support that gives you the courage and the strength to share your story. Maybe that's other parents, maybe that's professionals, maybe it's a support group, maybe it's an organization like, ACT. Because I think, we have to have kind of a critical mass of people willing to talk about what their experiences are. And sometimes in the autism world, we like to tell all the positive stories. We like to tell the story of the autistic person who became a lawyer, or the autistic person who, made the basketball shot at the end of the game, or, the fun, loving, positive, successful, heartwarming stories. Those are wonderful stories. But there are also very difficult stories. There are kids who have significant behaviors that interfere with their family and them being able to live a fully optimal life. There are challenging situations of people with disabilities confronting law enforcement in our country. We have issues of homelessness, of family members who struggle with the developmental disability. So we have to tell the full range of stories. We have to tell the truth. I actually have encouraged families to really write their story, as a like a journaling exercise, like put it in writing. How would you tell your story if you ever got to the point where you needed to share it? And then when those opportunities arise, they kind of have a narrative already, a script of how they might talk about their experience with autism. Because I think it's therapeutic, but I also think it's a stepping stone to being able to articulate, what those experiences actually are. And then I think you just simply have to step into it. I now take, several parents every year with me to Tallahassee to tell their story. And we meet with local legislators as well in their offices. And it's a journey. It takes a few years, I think, a few visits for someone to get comfortable sharing, finding the balance in how to tell the story. But I think, writing it out, really thinking through what they want to share, and building a critical mass. I think that's the other thing. You don't want it to just be one or two, loud voices. You really want it to be the hum of a whole community talking about their range of experiences. And I'm not sure I have any other, clever suggestions for how to do it. But I think you just, number one, have to decide you want to. And then number two, you have to kind of, plan for how you want to share the story. And I think writing it out or, talking about it to a confidant, a friend, or another loved one, or a provider that you trust can be very, very helpful. And parents should work side by side with professionals to affect change. Like it's not just the parents' responsibility, in Trinidad or in Miami to create change. It's still my responsibility to inspire them to want to speak, right? I see that as one of my strengths. And then to guide them, keep them on the path that moves the whole, community forward in some way, right? I mean, I've been here for 28 years now. So I know, I know everybody and I know how the system works and I know the pressure points that we can, focus on. And so I can guide them more effectively, but I can't do it alone and they can't do it alone. So it really has to be a merging of the minds and of the efforts. But I think when all people act in good faith, for collective progress, things are usually much better than if people are just kind of off on their own doing their own thing. One of the things in the beginning when I got here, I felt like there were different people in different groups trying to do lots of different things. And I think that was really fragmented. And we still have that problem in autism. It still can be a bit fragmented. But I think of our program now, the CARD Center, because of our long history and our network and our depth in the community, we're kind of the hub. Like a lot of good that comes to Floridians who have autism kind of flows through this network that we've built. So I think, and I'd love to see, ACT play a major role in that as we move forward, like to really be that centerpiece, with other partners, of course, but some entity has to drive the narrative and the conversation. Otherwise, too many different voices saying too many different things is a great way for people in power to just tune out. Why listen to all of them when they don't have the same message, right? It has to be a unified message. And maybe we don't share every single goal, but maybe we have enough collective goals that we can work on together. And I think that's what the CARD program has done very effectively in Florida.
I totally appreciate that. I particularly like, the sharing of the story. I always tell parents, I want to hear the good, the bad, and the ugly.
A whole story.
It's okay, go ahead, And I do find more and more a lot of parents approaching us, even at the Five Islands event that we had last weekend. Parents wanted to come and share their stories with us, and that was heartwarming to the point where we may even open up at the end of the month, saying that it doesn't end at the end of April, and to have a town hall meeting to hear the parent voices, those parents who are willing to speak, and yes, respecting the fact that not everybody is ready to share.
Yeah.
And Autism Connect, that connect word is the exact word that is going to drive us through this country and the different voices. We will be meeting, by the time this is played, actually, we would have met with the Autistic Society and trying to work together because as you said, there are lots of voices, but we want all of us to come together and connect to have that bigger voice. So
yeah, and I should have mentioned it earlier, but the Autism Society here in Florida is very much a partner with CARD in everything we do. In fact, it's even written into the statute that funded and formed CARD that the Autism Society president will review and approve board members of the CARD centers throughout the state, so that there's a real connection to the community in terms of who represents the autism community on the CARD constituent boards. And I think that partnership has really been strong and fruitful. So, that's what I mean about core organizations that really can do more collectively than they can do individually. But I'm glad to hear that people are coming and showing up and sharing their stories. I do want to comment, you mentioned April, and I will say that April is a bit of a double-edged sword for us because it's like everything it's the only month that all these other people not affiliated with autism want to do something about autism. And we're like, wait a minute, autism exists every day of the year, 365, 12 months of the year. So maybe we can spread this interest in autism out across the entire year instead of doing everything all at once and then forgetting it for 11 months, because our families don't have the luxury of forgetting it for 11 months, right? They have to deal with it every day, every month. So, but it's intense, April, and then it disappears. So we have to keep that conversation alive. People like you, people like me, people who run organizations that aim to make a difference, in the actual lives of people living with autism. So April for me is always, yeah, I always find myself a little frustrated by April.
Well said. I
I
agree.
joke that it's the quietest month of the year for us, and people always find that amusing.
I like
I mean,
that.
last weekend we had 5 events just on Saturday, and I'm like, come on, the families need more of this throughout the year, not just in April. I mean, it's a nice marketing moment, right? That's
Right.
really what it is, but it needs to be reconceptualized, I think. I always say autism every day, not autism.
Autism every day. I love it. What we even with the water park event last week, the organizer that we collaborated with, she asked, can we do this more often because it was so well attended? And we were like, of course, please let it
Yeah.
happen. And it's the start of other entities reaching out and saying, how can we have autism-friendly days as well? Um,
Wonderful.
so that's
The
good
community, I
news,
mean, our autism families, they're desperate for community, right? They're desperate for connection. They're desperate for engagement. We have trainings that we offer throughout the year, but our most popular events are when we simply have a card family day in the park, right? I have hundreds and hundreds of people come for that. So the training's wonderful. The support we provide is great, but just being with other families in a place where they feel like my kids can scream, they can run, they can stim, they can do whatever they want, and nobody cares, right? Because we all get it. It's just a safe, comfortable, wonderful sense of community. And that's what people are
being
desperate for.
judged. Yeah,
That's
not
what
being
they're desperate
judged, not being, looking at them at the corner of their eye, like, could you please control your child? I mean,
for.
that was the experience last year from a lot of the parents saying it was just an opportunity just to relax, and not feel like you're being judged all the time,
Yeah.
criticized,
And to
or
make those connections, like, the word connect, you said it, it's in your name. It's such a driving force for what our families, at the end of the day, what they really need, right, is connection.
for sure.
Because they're so isolated, so many of them, and they become more isolated over time if you don't build that community and those connections earlier.
Yes, I am. It's been 19 years practicing, and I'm now seeing my babies grow up, like I say. And recently, one dad, shout out to Nigel, his son I saw when he was just 2. He's now 18, and um, he's reaching that point of what's going to happen when I pass. What does the future hold for my adult autistic, right?
Mhm.
Um, in terms of that, could you shed some light on
Yeah, sure. I
adult and
think,
transitioning to adulthood?
well, yeah, I'd be happy to. And I will say that our card at the University of Miami, which is, the 3 southernmost counties of Florida, we have over 17,000 families now affiliated just with our card. And more than half of them are over the age of 16. So the population, is growing, as of course it should. Like, we forget that children with autism become adults with autism, I think, in this world, unfortunately. But we have a lot of initiatives that are devoted. We have a whole team now that's devoted to adult and transition services. So we've moved from a generalist model to more of a specialist model. So we have a whole team dedicated to that transition because we need people who are experts in the benefits that families are entitled to, the post-secondary options that are available to them, how to engage in pre-employment training and employment support, and then of course housing. I'm very much now involved in housing, and then yeah, just community life, and also special needs trusts and financial planning, guardianship. Like, all of these things are very specialized once kids become adults. So that dedicated team has really strengthened our ability to support families. But to be honest, I'm planning for transition with my patients, my clients, when they're 2 or 3. Like, in those initial meetings I have with families, we're always already from the start talking about how do you successfully prepare your child for life, right? It's not just about pre-K or kinder or getting through elementary school. It's like, what kind of skills do you want your child to have? What kind of supports do you think your child might need? What kind of financial planning do you need to do as a family, just in case the child needs lifelong supports? Hopefully not, but many of our kids will. And so it's important to start that conversation as early as possible. You don't wait till they're 16 or 18, or here in Florida, 22 when they exit school in some cases. So I'm already talking about things like, because you want parents to at least have heard what's expected of them as their kids are getting older. So I'm also talking with my parents of young kids about the unique skills they have, the unique interests they have. How do you turn those into possible jobs one day? Instead of trying to squash their unique interests, right? Why not try to nurture them while you're also building the other skills? So, and Temple Grandin talks beautifully about this when she speaks about, just the world needs all kinds of minds, I think was her TED Talk, which is a wonderful TED Talk if anyone hasn't seen it. And it's all about finding a mentor who can help you develop your kind of unique skill or your special interest, because that could be a job one day. It could be a social enterprise. It could be a micro enterprise. It could be, something that helps you become a wage earner or a contributor to society. So we're very active in the planning for transition and hosts a lot of trainings specifically devoted to transition issues and a lot of events just for adults. We have social groups. We have a program called Job Seekers, which is a manualized pre-employment training program where we teach interview skills, resume building, resume writing, how to dress for the job, not those soft skills in the workplace, like all of that stuff. And then we have partners who provide supported employment. So once our guys come through our pre-employment training program, we try to match them with one of our supported employment partners so that they can find jobs for them and support them in the community. Employment is very much a focus of what we do in our adult services, because we think, and I'm a strong believer that, because I know it with my own job, is it defines me. Like my job, my employment, my career is what defines Michael Alessandri. So I think it's important that people feel valued and they feel like they're bringing value. And I think work does that. Finding a place where you are earning, a wage that's appropriate, in an environment where you have coworkers and you're contributing in a meaningful way, I think brings your life meaning and brings your life value. And I happen to believe everyone can work anywhere on the spectrum. I think the question is, what level of support do they need to be successful in that work? And not everyone has to work 40 hours. I have a young man that works for me. He only comes 2 hours a week and he does shredding. He shreds our confidential documents, and he loves it. Like this is like the thing that makes his day. He wakes up on Wednesday mornings and says, go to UM or go to Card. He does that, and he's pretty much nonverbal except for some short phrases. So he's so motivated. Like he wakes up wanting to go to work and he wants to do this task, which is within his skill set. And he loves watching those papers just disappear into the shredder, as many of us who have some OCD traits would enjoy. It's like crossing something off your checklist. But to answer your question, parents have to plan from the very earliest days following diagnosis about life, down the line a bit. And then as they get even older, we're talking about geriatric care. Potentially our clients are living longer and longer as they would expect to. Parents have to think about the life of their child when they're not around. And that's a hard conversation. So professionals, and I'm pretty bold about this because I've been doing it a long time. I have no problem talking to parents from very early ages about planning for the future and including planning for life potentially when they're not around. Very hard. Most people ignore me. Most people don't want to think about it until they absolutely have to. But I think it's really our responsibility as professionals to be honest about, the journey. We can't predict at age 2, 3, 4, or 5 what that child's life may be like and what supports they may or may not need. So I always am about over planning. Like, let's put everything in place that you think you might need should the child, maybe not make as much progress over the course of their life as you are hoping for. Just plan, not for the worst. I don't like to say it in that term, but you have to have contingency plans and it has to start early. Here in the States, if you leave assets in a child's name, and they become an adult and you pass away as parents, the state will they will exhaust all of those assets and benefits, assets before the child can get access to the state and federal benefits that they're entitled to. So there are ways to protect those kinds of assets. But for me, the transition really is mostly for me about skill building from the time they're 2. You get the diagnosis and you're thinking, what kind of communication skills do they need? What kind of functional skills do they need? What kind of life skills do they need? What kind of functional academics are going to make their life as an adult more productive? Like all of that has to be thought of early on. And then really every step of the way. I mean, this is what, OTs, PTs, speech therapists, people in your field do, is that they think of functional skills. Like, what is the functional skill profile that my client needs in order to live a more optimal life, be as independent as possible, and ultimately be a contributing member of society in the form of employment when they're outside of school. So all of that, I'm just babbling
So
now,
well,
but
no, so well put, so important. And I find in my career, I have basically just stayed in the niche of early intervention and thank you for encouraging us to really help the families from as early as 2 years old, as you've said, thinking about overall life, just preparing for life in general. And I
yeah.
really appreciate you sharing that and
I
how.
think the problem is that we talk about this construct of transition. Like we really should eliminate that word and just talk about teaching a child to have the most functional skills necessary for life, right? It doesn't, because transition kind of implies that, oh, we can do it later when that time comes. You know
Very
what I mean?
true. Very
Instead of
true.
like, let's be thinking about it now every step of the way.
I mean, culturally in Trinidad, we tend to think of, oh my goodness, my child has reached this age and it's time for school.
Mhm.
Preschool, they think, okay, I'm hoping that my child will develop the skills and things will change. And then eventually the big deadline is he's 5 and he needs to be in elementary school. And then
Yeah.
parents feel pressured, right? And quite often then they have to face finding an inclusive education setting or
Mhm.
even a special needs setting depending on the supports the child requires. And I would love for you to shed light on that feeling and that pressure, just share with parents. And I think you did touch on it with preparing them for life,
Yeah.
functional living, yes. But how can parents collaborate with educators, with school administrators to promote that inclusive education practice as well for children within the school setting?
Mhm. Yeah, I don't know enough, obviously, about Trinidad in terms of the way things are structured from an educational perspective, but I live in the real world. So I always tell parents I live in the real world. So I have idealistic thoughts about the way education should unfold for learners with disabilities. And I would love that to see a world where everyone is engaged in inclusive learning with the level of support that they need. But I also recognize in this real world that I live in, we have a system here in the States that's not supported well enough to provide meaningful, inclusive learning to every kid. So some kids may need a more specialized setting, initially, and maybe sometimes always. And some parents want that actually. Some parents are really advocating for having their kids educated separately because I think they have the impression that they'll be safer in some cases or they'll be more supported in some cases. But my philosophy is generally one of inclusive learning, but I'm not dogmatic about it. I understand that you have to have choices too, and you have to have a continuum of services and supports to meet the continuum of needs that people with autism have. I mean, there's a variety of presentations of autism, right? So there's not going to be one size that fits all. But I think it would help to have an educational system that not just had laws that encouraged inclusion, but actually really had attitudes and behaviors that reflected that they believed in the spirit of the law. Now, we don't always have that. I remember being at an IEP meeting years ago and talking about the inclusive education of a student that I was there supporting. And the principal said, inclusion sounds wonderful. We'll look to do that in a few years. And I was like, in a few years, this kid needs inclusion now. So the law says it's supposed to happen, but the law doesn't necessarily make it happen in this country. So parents have to continue to advocate for the needs of their child in I always say, the most sugary, sweet way possible, because I think my approach is always very positive, and I find that I get more results than kind of attacking people. I don't think that's a helpful approach. But also we need the schools and the educators and the administrators and the teachers to get more education about how to meaningfully include learners with unique abilities in their schools. Because I don't think for the vast majority of people who become teachers in a general education environment, they have very little exposure to how to meaningfully including visual supports, communication supports, social supports, behavioral supports. They simply don't get trained at the level of expertise that they would need to do this work well. And so because they're not feeling competent about doing this work well, sometimes there's a resistance to doing it at all. So we have to do better in our training programs to make sure that we're educating and then graduating general education teachers to do what special education teachers do, which is why I think we need to just teach every teacher to teach every student, right? Like, I don't love the idea that some people go to school to be specialists in dyslexia or specialists in autism or specialists in third grade or fifth grade. I think everyone, and I think this about the medical degree as well, because doctors also tell us they're not well trained in autism unless they're going into neurology or behavioral developmental pediatrics or some related field. So we just need to invest more on the training front too, so that we don't have this dichotomy between parents wanting more inclusive education and the right supports for their child, and then a system that really doesn't have the capacity or the knowledge or the wherewithal to do it. So that's where we need to close the gap. And that's kind of the role CARD plays. We educate and support parents, but we also are educating and supporting schools and then trying to build that bridge between the two. And we're not perfect, God knows, but it would be a lot worse without us. Let's just say that. So I think there's responsibility on parents to advocate, more effectively with the right language, with the right tone. And then there's pressure and responsibility on the principals, the teachers, the school community, the I don't know how you're structured, maybe the minister of education, maybe in your country. Like, there has to be someone has to set an expectation for the culture of inclusion that needs to happen throughout the educational system. And that usually comes from, in our community, it's our schools are really governed by their principals, meaning the principal of the school, not their ideals.
Right.
And so I think we just need to, the schools are much more inclusive culturally if the principal sets that tone here in our country. Your country is a relatively small country compared to ours. So I would imagine the Minister of Education, whoever he or she is, could set a tone and an expectation. And then, of course, provide the funding for the schools to be able to support the level of support that maybe some kids might need. But I also think, again, I think inclusion should be the optimal goal for all kids, but we also have to create an array of options for some kids who maybe the parents want a different choice, or maybe they're on their way to a more inclusive education, but they need more intensive supports in the interim. So every child's different, so it's hard to speak in generalities. But I think expectations are important. I think culture in an educational system is important. We still have places in the States, in Florida, where our kids with autism are not invited to field trips or not invited to the prom. We have in Miami-Dade, I think they have their own prom for kids with autism. And so we still can do better at creating more inclusive experiences for our learners who have unique abilities and unique presentations. I don't know if I answered your question, Danella, but hopefully it's helpful.
We have to start the conversation somewhere, right? And that's exactly what you did. And so that is helpful.
Yeah. And it would be good to know, like, I don't know, like, it would be good for someone in, I'll use Trinidad as an example, since we're here today, is to survey the parents of children with special needs to find out what kind of education they're looking for, what kind of support their child needs. Like, do we even know? Do we have a good sense of who has autism in Trinidad? Do we know where all these kids are? Do all the kids go to school, or do some parents keep their kids home? Like, that snapshot of who has autism and what do they need in Trinidad would be a good investment of government dollars to really have a landscape on which to build future programming. I think I shared with you, I spent some time in the Bahamas doing, we've spent a few days talking and visiting Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health, talking to different providers, early intervention, all the way up to adult services, to kind of write a report for, the lay of the land, if you will, and where there were opportunities for more interconnection, where there were opportunities for growth. I mean, that would be, an interesting exercise, in the future for Trinidad. I mean, we could do it every day here and still not solve all the problems, but you have a country that's where I think that would have some impact, because it's small enough to be able to assess all of those assets and make recommendations for
Well,
enhancements.
roll up your sleeves, because that's the
I'm coming
conversation
to Trinidad.
that's the conversation we're having. You know that. So
Yeah, I think it would be interesting. I mean, I think it would be so interesting to go, and not just Trinidad. I won't put you on the spot, but to go to and should I be saying Trinidad and Tobago? So,
yeah, cool.
TT, sorry about that for all the Tobago
That's okay.
residents watching. Um, I'm just an American. I know nothing.
Oh,
I get that a lot when I travel the world. No, but I think there's such an opportunity in many of these countries that are smaller and close to the work we do, to really do a deep dive in understanding the system of care, right? And where you can, and I don't ever say improvements, I always like to say enhancements, because I think you always have to build on what's already there and not try to create something completely new, because it'll never work. It'll never work to just create something new. You have to build on the assets you already have.
yes. Thank you. Well, like I said,
And I will say also, one of our best students ever in our department is back home in Trinidad. She's the BCBA, and we're really excited about what she's going to bring to your country too.
yes, and
I
we've
won't mention her name
been.
because I don't want anyone to pick on her.
I think it might be a good little plug for
A
her. So
plug.
it's free. I know who you're talking about. Um, then I do want to touch on mental health and parents taking care of themselves to be able
Yes.
to take care of their children, and also considering mental health for autistics as well, and what we need to consider with that. I think that's something that's being.
Well, yeah, I think it's a great topic. I think certainly our card center here is based in the Department of Psychology. So we have a lot of folks who are psychologists who that's a primary focus of their work. I run regular monthly mothers groups and fathers groups. And we also have very active WhatsApp groups that are related to those support groups. So we meet live and in person, and then we support each other on a daily basis through the very active WhatsApp groups. You know, Parents cannot take care of their child unless they first take care of themselves, right? It's the same, it's the example everyone uses about, the oxygen on an airplane, right? You can't help your child unless you have enough oxygen first. So you have to take care of yourself, and you have to do that by, shoring up the supports that are available to you in your life, whether it's your friends, your family, people like me, you, that can be supportive. You have to build, in autism, in the years ago, we used to talk about the circle of friends and building the circle when we're talking about social skills and friendship networks for kids. And parents have to do the same. Like, you have to create those concentric circles of support around you, some that are more, proximal and some that are more distal, so that you have layers of support from your family, your friends, your loved ones, and your community. And community is a big part of it in autism, because many families can't always rely on their own immediate family members for support, because not everyone, I mean, at least here, we're in a very multicultural community, and I can tell you that, parents often tell us that their parents, the grandparents, don't always either agree with the diagnosis or believe the diagnosis is accurate or agree with the treatment approaches that are being recommended by the professionals. And so it can feel very isolated within the family. And so you really have to build a bigger network beyond the family so that you're feeling supported by people who are, understanding what you're going through and maybe living the same journey that you're on. So, yeah, I mean, I think, listen, we see a lot of depression, we see a lot of anxiety. The other thing about autism, it is a highly genetic disorder. And so there are elements of autism that sometimes affect family members. And I think that's important to acknowledge as well. And sometimes I've had many dads who've got diagnosed after their children were diagnosed, right? So it's an interesting journey. And you have people sometimes who've been living with autism who are now parents of children with autism. And people who were not diagnosed as kids who were later discovered that they were autistic may have had a series of life events that have been very negative, like it's a cumulative effect of negative life events and social isolation sometimes. So the mental health impacts can be enormous in those situations. But just the day-to-day stress, even if you embrace autism as a unique ability, a unique form of diversity, it's still a difficult journey for many of our families. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. We have families whose kids are doing very, very well, but there's still moments of great distress, still moments of difficulty. We've done a lot of research on marital relationships in the context of autism. And, we discover things that you would expect, which is parents who have more optimism or who find benefit in dealing with autism or in what autism has brought to their family. Those folks do really, really well. And there are some differences across cultures, but then there's depression, there's stress, there's that initial grief response of maybe not having the child you imagined you would have when you were pregnant. So all of that has to be managed, with families. And every professional, every educator, every doctor that the family goes to for their child should also be trained to understand that every conversation you're having with a parent about a child is also being received by a parent who has stress, who has grief, who has their own emotional, difficulties because of their own life separate from their child. And we have to think about the way we communicate with parents. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to mobilize them to act on behalf of their children unless we've also taken care of them. Most of my work, people say I'm an expert in autism. I think if anything, I'm an expert in supporting families in dealing with their child's autism. I don't think I'm one of the best people in the world for autism, but I don't think I really don't. I take very, very good care of our families. And I take that very seriously. So, because I want them to feel not just supported, I want them to feel loved, actually. I want them to feel, and you will want them to feel heard, but also I want them to feel hugged, that someone really, and I'm very affectionate and warm, and I'm also very accessible. Like, people know they can reach me at a moment's notice. And I think that's really critical, because when families feel lost and alone and isolated and maybe disconnected from their family support, having a professional that they can count on. And I tell our team here, like, you're not, that thing they teach you in college and in graduate school about your professional and personal boundaries. I'm like, erase all of that, because in order to really help our families, you have to be part of the family. You really have to be part of the family. Within reason, right? You're not, expecting a Christmas present or anything, but you have to care enough about them and their well-being to really be present for them. And sometimes you're the only one, as the professional, that the family has. And so taking care of the parent at a deeper level, I think, is part of our responsibility. It's not like I did my 30 minutes or an hour with your child and now you should go, right? Yeah, exactly. No. So anyway, I'm babbling again, but
Yeah. Good
I'm
babble.
making my points, I think, which is that the mental health, the overlay of, I think we can't underestimate the challenge of living every single day with a difficult disability. It is a challenging disability. Some families have a very easy journey, and God bless them, but the majority of our families struggle, if not always, at critical points along the journey. And we have to just be there to provide that support. And then the comorbidity, of course, with autism, particularly higher functioning autism, for lack of a better term these days.
Right.
Have
Careful.
anxiety, depression, sometimes psychosis, all that are affecting the individual and making their journey much more complex. And so, high degree of suicidality sometimes in cases that are, older and higher functioning in terms of IQ and more emotionally, kind of impacted. Because again, there are different forms of autism, and sometimes the individuals with autism who have the lower support needs, the individuals we used to call higher functioning, they're super aware of how difficult life is for them socially, how hard it is for them to make friends, how isolated they feel at school, how it's difficult it is to find someone who shares their interests. Like, so that those cumulative negative life experiences really can peel away at one's confidence and self-esteem. And that results in some of those secondary effects of anxiety, depression, and the like. So I think we have to, particularly for that segment of the population, provide more mental health support long before we would even anticipate mental health issues, right? This is just about, again, loving people, supporting them, making everyone feel special and connected. And that's where, a higher quality inclusive education can be very, very effective, because if kids feel more a part of their classroom, more close to their friends, then some of those negative effects later on maybe wouldn't happen as much.
Thank you. Yes, as much as we didn't even plan to speak about mental health, it just occurred to me that it's something that is usually, not spoken about, and it's a very important part of it. And I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, and the results can be devastating. I don't want to go negative here, but and we had a mother who drowned her child, during COVID. Obviously, we don't know much about that mother in terms of her own mental health prior to having a child on the spectrum, but it's a challenging journey. And I think the other thing I want to say is that we don't often talk about in the autism field those kids who are with more severe and profound presentations. I talked about it a little bit earlier, but there's more and more energy now around that population, thanks to parents who are driving this conversation, because they're tired of hearing all these wonderful stories about the artist or the lawyer or the singer on television.
Superpowers,
The
right?
autism is a superpower. Like, and I get the positive spin. I want to share that too, and I want to honor and embrace and elevate our learners with autism who are lucky enough to have those skills. But we can't silence the stories of those families who are living in fear or living in trauma, living in isolation, because their kids are much more complex. And so I always want to give voice to that segment of the population too, and encourage people to discover some of these organizations that have emerged in the last few years that are really focused on this idea of profound autism as something really separate and distinct from these other autisms, if you will, that people really hear about more in the media, particularly during April as Autism Awareness Month, because you don't hear the sad stories, you don't hear the devastating stories, you hear, the positive, happy,
And even Hollywood,
inspirational
and what
stories.
what is portrayed in Hollywood, it just casts this whole feeling of, oh well, it can't be that bad. You can
Yeah,
have the Sheldon Coopers or
right.
you know,
Or the good doctor,
the good doctor.
right?
Those are the good stories, the
Mhm.
success stories. And you're right, the population of fecal smearing, self-interest behaviors, and not being able to even take some parents don't even take their children out in public as a result,
Very difficult for many.
really needs to be addressed and supported in any
We
way.
had a family that had her son out in public, and he had a meltdown, and the police were called. The police, really didn't know what they had walked into. And, these are situations that can go, I mean, unfortunately, nothing horrible happened in that situation, but we had another case where in North Miami where a caretaker was out on the street with a young man with autism, and the child had a meltdown. The neighbors called the police. The police came. They actually shot, and they shot the caretaker. They were aiming at the child with autism, the adult with autism, but they shot the caretaker because they didn't understand that the child was not. They thought the story was they thought the child was holding a gun, and that was what triggered the shooting. But the point is, when you do go out in public with a child with more complex behaviors, and the public doesn't understand what they're seeing, bad things can happen. And so these families, we need to tell their stories, we need to give them voice, and we need a better system of care to allow them to live the same lives that families with kids with more mild presentations and just neurotypical people are allowed to live.
Right.
So I worry about them really the most, because
Yes.
they don't have a voice and they're more isolated. And the community doesn't seem to want to tell those more complex stories, because they're hard to see.
Right.
They're really hard to see, and they're hard for professionals, because I can't. I can't fix all those problems for families. I can't make the problems go away. I can support them and guide them to resources, but I don't have the magic wand that would make everything better. And I wish I did. And it just breaks my heart when you
Do we
just can't
all?
solve a problem for a family.
Right. Do we all? Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we are ending on this very negative.
No, we got to turn it around. We have a few more
Turn it
minutes.
around. Let's turn it around. Okay, then.
No, what I'll say is that, no matter where you are on the autism spectrum, or no matter how, easy the journey is or complex the journey is, like there's always hope. There's always something to look toward. I think I'm so excited about, the fact that we as an organization continue to grow and evolve and find new ways to support people. The community continues to respond in positive ways. We have urgent care facilities that are now autism friendly. We have an airport, Miami International Airport, that has a sensory room. We have stadiums in Miami that have autism friendly spaces. We have museums and art centers and doctors' offices. And, so to have a community just trying to change in order to make the world more inclusive and accepting, that's what we want. We want the professional to work with the family, but also to work with the broader community to create a true sense of community, right? And true inclusion, no matter where you are in the spectrum and where you live in the world. I mean, that's the ultimate goal, right? Safe places and spaces, comfortable places and spaces for everybody.
And
So, Trinidad, you're on my radar.
good. Lovely. Dr. Alessandri, we appreciate you for all of this information. It's been very enlightening, very inspiring, and your wealth of knowledge and your dedication that we can see shine through your words and we can just see the passion to supporting individuals with autism and their families alike. It really shines through in every word that you speak, and we
Thank
appreciate you.
you.
So thanks
Thank you so
again
much.
for your time, your expertise, your wisdom. Thank you
You
for
are very
sharing
welcome.
wisdom with us. And I think this has been a conversation that hopefully will fuel an ongoing effort in advocacy for parents to really be that voice that we spoke about, of really preparing our children for life in general. And thank you again for your unwavering dedication and commitment. We're grateful
Thank
for you.
you.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Bye.
See you soon.